Welcome back. You're watching Newscentre. Now, the much-anticipated Digital Data Protection Bill has been cleared by the Cabinet, and sources tell us that it is likely to be tabled in the monsoon session of the Parliament. Now, the bill seeks to address issues with regard to data privacy and data security in the country. The initial draft of the bill was put forth in November last year and has gone through several rounds of public consultation. Following the feedback, a second draft was made, which went through ministerial discussions. The draft bill focused on personal data and sought to regulate personal and non-personal data as well. The bill, when passed, will also apply to the processing of data outside of India if it involves offering goods or services or profiling individuals in India. For more on this, we're now joined by Rama Vedashree. She's the former CEO of Data Security Council of India, as well as Aprajita Bharti, co-founder of TQH. Thank you so much for joining us. Ms. Vedashree, let me come to you. You were a part of the initial deliberations way back in 2017. Looking back at that experience and looking now at the latest bill, what are your takeaways in terms of what the industry has to now deal with in terms of compliances? We have easing of data localization norms, easing of norms on sharing of personal data, penalties have been reduced. Are you happy from an industry perspective?
Yeah, first, I think what has been taken to the cabinet, we still don't know, right? Because that will be known only when it's tabled in the parliament, I understand. So we are commenting on the November 2022 version, which I think was lacking in a lot of the details. So we are waiting for what is the final version that is actually tabled in parliament. Definitely, I think some of the provisions that came up in that version were quite music to the ears of the industry members. But still, the lack of details is worrying, because when any industry member, whatever is the company in any sector, looks for some clarity when they go ahead and implement the privacy program to be able to conform and comply with the bill. So I think it was lacking in a lot of details. While it is focusing on digital data, from the privacy supporters or people who want a strong privacy regime in the country, while there is mention of digitized data, how will it, pan out actually when even in a fully computerized, digitized environment, there is a lot of paper-based data collection or information collection. So some of these ambiguities hopefully are getting resolved, because various industry bodies and industry members did give submissions to MeitY, and I'm hoping they're all factored in the version that has been taken to the cabinet, and as we hear, it has been approved.
Sure. Ms. Bharti, let's get you in on this conversation. Your first reading, again, the latest framework that we have, of course, is the November 2022 draft. Basis that we're making these informed suggestions. I would like to put to you a comment that came from Justice B.N. Sri Krishna. He was not entirely happy with the structure of the Data Protection Board, saying that it cannot possibly serve as a regulator, given as how it is likely to operate as a captive entity of the government, and therefore not perhaps successfully perform the role of a regulator, of an independent regulator.
Right. So, hi, Ashmit. I agree with Rama here when, she says that we don't know what we are commenting on right now. But I think in the 2022 bill that we had, you're right, there were issues around, and I think Justice B.N. Sri Krishna also did mention that, we don't have a data protection authority or a regulator-like structure that we had in the earlier drafts of the bill. So obviously, we don't have that one arm distance from the rule-making powers that MeitY now has that we had earlier. This is not just problematic from the perspective of having a check and balance when it comes to making rule, the power of making rules, but it's also problematic from the perspective of, for example, what is EU's requirement for, India to be a country where, they let their citizens' data to be there. So I think some of those issues were unresolved when it came to cross-border data flows as well, that I think the industry will be looking at with much interest, because in the last bill, we also had provisions regarding whitelisting countries where Indian data could be stored. But I think the industry really made their opinion known that it should be a blacklisting process, because whitelisting process is likely to be slow. So not just this issue about Data Protection Authority, I think there were many issues that were unresolved. And I think broadly, there was also just I think concern about too many things left to delegated legislation, and too much power to make rules, and no provisions regarding what the rule-making process would look like. So we are hoping that in the next draft that also has been taken into account.
Sure. Ms. Vedashree, let me come back to you in terms of the obligations that have been cast on data fiduciaries. Again, from an industry perspective, do they appear to be onerous? There are some compliances with respect to age gating, where consent is sought to be required from the parents. There are certain compliances which the industry at the consultation stage had red flagged. Your take on that?
Yes, I think at least some of the provisions, like, removing of the criminal liabilities, industry did welcome on that. But the entire responsibility of children data and consent of the guardians, and how do we implement that? I think worldwide that has been a problem of how would a data fiduciary or a controller implement this entire age gating. Particularly in India, we do have this challenge of how do we reach out to those parents and guardians for their consent. I think at the level of implementation, we do foresee challenge as
Sure.
Privacy professionals. But as Aprajita pointed out, I think the lack of details is what would be worrying, because a lot will be left to delegated rule making, which would be the purview of the executive, which in case here is the MeitY or Ministry of Electronics and IT. So we need to wait for a lot of these details. The bill itself does not throw much light, but I do agree implementing a comprehensive compliance program to meet some of these provisions around protecting children data. It is a welcome measure, I think, but how do we go about implementing that would be a challenge. And anything there where there is so much lack of detail and we have to wait for delegated rules to be made, I think that would always be a challenge.
Sure. We're almost out of time. Aprajita, I'll come to you for one final comment, only 30 seconds. One common criticism has been the exceptions and the exemptions granted to the government. That has received some criticism from no less than Justice B.N. Sri Krishna himself. Your quick take on that?
I think, Ashmit, that is something which is very worrying about the bill, and we saw it, for example, with the Govind data breach, right? That was something that was again highlighted when we had the recent data breach, that if the government itself is exempt from some of the obligations of the fiduciaries, then the digital public infrastructure that we are creating and a lot of data that rests with the government is also at risk. And that is something which, again, same as I was just talking about, that do we have advocacy, do we fulfill the advocacy norms of, say, for example, EU, etc., would depend on some of those clauses as well. So that is something that we also need to address. Sure. And just one last thing on implementation, in 2021 version that the Parliamentary Committee had done, there was a 2-year period for implementation of the law. In the last version, there was no specified timeline. So I think it will be interesting to also see when the bill comes in that what is that timeline looking now for the industry to prepare itself.
Indeed, a lot of question marks at this stage, which will begin to get answered once the final version is put out in the public domain. Ms. Vedashree, Ms. Bharti, thank you so much for your time and perspective. But that's all the time that we have for on this edition of Newscentre. More news and updates will continue right here. Keep watching CNBC TV 18.